My brother told everyone I got fired for stealing from the register. He cried at my mom's kitchen table while he said it. I was standing in the driveway with a box of my desk stuff listening through the screen door. I could hear the exact pitch of his voice when it broke. I'd heard that pitch my whole life. It was the sound Ricky made whenever he needed someone to believe him. I believed it for 26 years. Our whole family did. That's the thing about being the reliable one. People assume you've already handled it. They assume you're fine. They stop checking. I need to back up. Because the part that matters most isn't the moment I got fired. It's not even the application that landed on my desk 2 years later. The part that matters is why I said nothing when I could have. That's the part I've spent the most time sitting with. And if I'm being completely honest, I'm still not sure I made the right call. Ricky is my younger brother by 4 years. There are just the two of us, no other siblings. Growing up, that gap was everything. He was the little one and I was the responsible one. And those roles got locked in so early that neither of us ever really questioned them. When something broke in the house, I fixed it or I got blamed for it. When Ricky got in trouble at school, I walked him home and helped him figure out what to tell mom. When he forgot to do his homework 3 nights in a row in 6th grade, I sat with him at the kitchen table until midnight, making sure it was done. I didn't resent it then. I want to be clear about that. I genuinely didn't mind. Ricky was funny in a way I wasn't. He could walk into any room and within 5 minutes everyone was laughing. He had this quality that I never had, where people just wanted to be around him. I was quieter, more internal. I was the one who'd rather organize the garage than go to the party, and Ricky, for all his chaos, genuinely looked up to me. He said it directly sometimes, in the clumsy way younger brothers say things like that. He'd bump my shoulder after I helped him with something and say that I was the smartest person he knew, and I believed him, or I wanted to. The pattern started showing itself in high school, if I'm being honest about it now. Not stealing, nothing like that, just a kind of slippage. A tendency for things around Ricky to go sideways and for him to land on his feet at everyone else's expense. His junior year, he borrowed my car without asking and got a speeding ticket. I found out when the ticket arrived in the mail addressed to me because the car was registered in my name. I paid it. I didn't tell our parents because I didn't want Ricky to lose driving privileges when he was already struggling. That felt like protecting him. Looking back, it was just the first installment on a debt I didn't know I was taking on. After high school, I went to work right away. Community college for a year, then I got the job at Kellerman's Hardware and realized within the first 6 months that I was genuinely good at it. Not just at the physical part, the stocking and the forklift and the inventory counts. I was good at the systems. Gerald Kellerman, the owner, noticed early. He was the kind of man who'd been in the hardware business for 30 years and had a nose for who understood how things worked versus who just followed directions. Gerald would walk the floor every morning with a coffee mug that said Kellerman's on the side, and he'd stop and talk to you. Not about pleasantries, but about actual problems. What was the vendor turnaround on the specialty fasteners? Whether the lumber display made sense for how customers moved through the store. Why we were losing repeat business on the paint side when our prices were competitive. I loved those conversations. I ate them up. I started staying late voluntarily, not to impress anyone, just because I was genuinely interested in the puzzle of how a retail business actually functions. By the end of my first year, I'd built a vendor tracking spreadsheet that Gerald used to renegotiate 2 of his biggest supply contracts. He gave me a small bonus and shook my hand and told me I thought like an owner. By year 2, I was running the floor on Saturdays. By year 3, I was assistant manager with keys to everything. The safe, the back office, the building alarm. Gerald paid me better than he had to, and I knew it, and I worked like I knew it. We had a mutual respect that I didn't take for granted. I also had a crew that I liked. Donnie ran the lumber section and had worked there longer than anyone. A big, quiet guy who knew every product in that store by heart and could cut anything to spec in under 2 minutes. Simone handled customer service and was so patient with difficult customers that Gerald called her our secret weapon. Marcus was young, still in college, working weekends to pay his tuition, sharp as a tack and going places. We had a rhythm. The store worked. Then Ricky's situation changed. He'd been doing all right for a while, or what looked like all right from the outside. He'd been with his girlfriend, Vanessa, since they were both 20. She was steadier than him, worked in medical billing, had her act together in the ways he didn't. When she got pregnant with their first kid, Ryan, Ricky surprised everyone by stepping up. He took a job at a distribution warehouse, showed up on time, didn't complain. We all breathed a little. Then the distribution company downsized and Ricky got cut in the second round. He picked up gig work, delivery driving mostly, but the income was inconsistent and the expenses weren't. By the time Vanessa was pregnant with their second, Connor, Ricky was borrowing money from our parents on a rotating basis. Small amounts, $50 here, $100 there, always with a specific reason and a specific date he'd pay it back. He never paid it back. My parents never mentioned it because they loved him and didn't want the confrontation. I got a call from Ricky on a Tuesday night in February. He was outside, I could hear the wind, and I could tell from his voice that he'd been sitting on this call for a while before he made it. He said he needed a job, a real one, something steady with a schedule and benefits, and that didn't require a car that was about to fail inspection. I asked him what happened to the delivery work. He said it was getting to be too much. The wear on the car, the unpredictability. He said he needed something he could count on. I sat with it for a minute. I thought about Gerald. I thought about what it would mean to put my name behind someone. I thought about the thing I always thought about when it came to Ricky, which was whether this was the moment he'd actually steadied out. I told him to come in on Friday and I'd introduce him him to Gerald. Ricky was charming in the interview in the exact way you'd expect. Gerald liked him immediately, the way everyone liked him immediately. He asked good questions, laughed at the right moments, and when Gerald asked why he wanted to work in hardware specifically, Ricky said he liked working with his hands and he liked places where things made sense. Gerald looked at me after that and nodded slightly. Ricky started the following Monday in receiving. The first month was genuinely good. He showed up on time, did the work, asked questions when he didn't know something. Donnie took a liking to him. Even Simone, who was skeptical of anyone new, said he was all right. I felt something I can only describe as relief, the specific kind you feel when the thing you were afraid would go wrong doesn't. The second month, things started to feel slightly off to me, though I couldn't have articulated why. Just a change in frequency. Ricky was around the registers more than his job required. Receiving is in the back. There's no reason to be up front unless you're pulling a product for a customer order, and that was supposed to go through me or Simone. But I'd catch him near the registers during slow periods, chatting with whoever was on shift, seemingly killing time. I didn't say anything because it wasn't wrong exactly, just different from how he'd been. Then I saw the first flag in the spreadsheet. It was a Thursday, end of the day. I was reconciling the day's transactions the way I always did before closing. A return had been processed at 2:17 p.m. for $22.40, a box of specialty screws, mid-range item. The return was logged correctly in the system, transaction number, reason code, everything. But when I went to cross-reference it with the restocking log, the screws weren't there. The physical product hadn't come back into inventory. That happens sometimes. Items got miscategorized, put in the wrong bin, logged under a similar SKU by mistake. I flagged it in the system as a discrepancy and moved on. 2 days later, another one. 1475s, a tube of silicone sealant. Same thing. Return processed in the system. No corresponding inventory. I didn't go to Gerald. Not yet. I told myself I was being methodical. I told myself I needed more data before I accused the system of anything, let alone a person. But I already knew. I think I knew from the second discrepancy. The way they appeared, small amounts spaced out just far enough, not random errors, but a pattern that someone had thought about. Someone who knew enough about the tracking system to know where the gaps were. And the only person who had asked me detailed questions about how the return and restocking logs connected was Ricky. He'd asked in his second week, framed as trying to understand the whole flow. I'd explained it to him because that's what I do. I explain things. I'd showed him exactly where the system reconciled returns against physical inventory and where the delays in that reconciliation created a window. I built a separate spreadsheet off the system data, just for myself, kept it on my personal laptop, nothing connected to the store servers. I went back 6 weeks from the first flag I'd noticed and ran through every return transaction against the restocking log. I found 9 discrepancies, 9 small amounts, nothing over $40, nothing that would trigger an automatic audit alert. Total exposure across the 6 weeks was about $230. I watched Ricky at the register for 3 days after that. He was good at it. That's the honest truth, and I'm not going to minimize it. He'd wait until a lull, not a complete dead period, but the kind of almost busy where everyone was occupied enough that nobody was watching the registers specifically. He'd help a customer with a return, run it through the system correctly, say everything the right way, and then the moment the customer walked away and before anyone was paying attention, he'd close the drawer and in the same motion, his hand came out empty. I only saw it cleanly once, on the second day. He didn't know I was watching. He thought I was in the back office, which is where I usually was at that time of day, but I'd positioned myself behind a display of shelving units at the end of the aisle with a sight line to register to. I watched him do it, and I felt nothing at first. That was the strangest part. Just a kind of settling, like a piece of furniture finally sitting level that had been wobbling for years. Then the feeling came. Not anger, not yet. Just a heaviness that I didn't know what to do with. I had options. I could go to Gerald with the spreadsheet data and what I'd seen and let the formal process handle it. That was the right thing to do. That was obviously the right thing to do. Gerald had trusted me. The store had trusted me. I'd built the systems that made this traceable in the first place. But Ricky had a 4-month-old. Vanessa had gone back to work already because they needed her income, and her mother was watching Connor 2 days a week because they couldn't afford full-time childcare. If Ricky lost this job under a theft investigation, it wouldn't just be a job. It would be a record. It would follow him into every application, every background check, every conversation about whether he was reliable. And underneath that, underneath all of it, was the thing I didn't want to look at directly. I'd vouched for him. Gerald had hired Ricky because I'd put my name on it. If Ricky was stealing from the register, what did that say about my judgment, about whether Gerald could trust me? I told myself I was protecting Ricky. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd have a private conversation with him, that I'd make it stop without blowing everything up. I never had that conversation. I kept planning it and putting it off and finding reasons to wait one more day. And while I waited, Ricky kept going. By the time the Friday deposit came up $800 short, the spreadsheet on my personal laptop had 41 entries. The $800 was different. That wasn't a register skim. I think what happened, and I've spent time working through the mechanics of it, is that Ricky had gotten more confident, or gotten greedy, or some combination. At some point, the small individual amounts stopped feeling like enough, and he went for something larger and more direct. Exactly how, I never knew. I didn't ask later, and by the time I could have, it didn't matter. Gerald called me into the back office on a Monday morning. He had 2 coffees on the desk. That was the detail that told me everything. 2 coffees, because Gerald didn't usually do that. He drank his coffee alone while he did the morning reconciliation. Putting 2 cups on the desk meant he'd thought about this conversation ahead of time. It meant he was trying to make it easier. He sat down and set the discrepancy report between us and didn't look at me right away. He looked at the paper, then he looked up. He said there was an $800 shortage in the Friday deposit. He said he'd run the numbers 3 times and the gap was consistent. He said he needed to understand if I had any explanation for it. Gerald was a fair man. That's the thing I want to be clear about. He wasn't accusing me dramatically. He wasn't raising his voice. He was doing the thing a good owner does, which is asking the person responsible for the money to account for the money. And the person responsible for the money was me. I had options in that moment too. I could have handed him the laptop, pulled up the spreadsheet, showed him 41 entries and told him exactly where to look and who to look at. I could have saved my job, my reputation, my trajectory to the East Side location, everything. Instead, I sat there and I let the silence answer for me. I don't know exactly why. I've tried to explain it to myself in 100 different ways over the 2 years that followed, and I've never landed on a single clean reason. Part of it was the panic, the freeze that happens when you've spent weeks avoiding a decision, and then suddenly the decision is happening anyway, and it's happening in the worst possible way, and your brain goes blank. Part of it was still that thing about my name being on him, the unwillingness to say out loud that I'd made a mistake trusting Ricky when I'd bet my credibility on him. Part of it, maybe the biggest part, was a kind of self-punishment I had known. I'd watched it happen. I'd built the proof and sat on it. Whatever Gerald thought I'd done, I hadn't done it, but I hadn't stopped it. And I think some part of me felt like those things were almost the same. Gerald was quiet for a long time after I didn't answer. Then he said he was sorry. He said he'd valued having me there and he didn't want this. He said he'd give me a good reference if I needed one, that this wouldn't go to law enforcement given the circumstances, but that he couldn't keep me on. I said I understood. I signed the termination form. Gerald printed it out himself and slid it across with a pen. I signed where the line was. My hand didn't shake, which surprised me. I carried my box out through the back, past the loading dock, past the dumpsters, through the side gate into the parking lot. It was a Thursday morning in November, and it was cold, and the sky had that flat white color that means winter is actually here now. I sat in my car for probably 20 minutes. When I drove home, I passed the diner where Ricky and I used to eat breakfast with our dad on Sunday mornings when we were kids. That wasn't on my way home. I wasn't thinking about where I was going. Ricky was at my mother's house that evening. I know because my neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, mentioned it when I was getting my mail. She said she'd seen my brother's car in the driveway and asked if everything was okay. I said yes. Then I went inside and sat in my kitchen without turning the lights on. My phone stayed quiet until around 9. Then my mother called. She asked if I was okay. Her voice had a specific, careful quality to it. The tone she used when she already knew something but was giving you a chance to explain it your way. I said I was fine, that I'd had a hard day at work. She said she'd heard. She said Ricky had told them. She said she was worried about me, but that she also needed to understand what had happened. The words came at me in a specific order. The same words I'd heard Ricky deploy my whole life when he needed a story to hold together, fragments of real things arranged to point in a false direction. He hadn't said I stole exactly. He'd said the money went missing and that it was complicated and that he didn't want to believe it, but that he'd seen me near the safe that day and that sometimes people go through hard times and make choices and he just hoped I'd be okay. That was enough. That was more than enough with our parents, who loved us both and couldn't imagine either of us doing something terrible and so had to choose which version of the story they could live with. They chose the version that kept Ricky in his job and kept the family dinner table from becoming a crime scene. My father sent me a text that night that said, "Call me when you're ready to talk." We haven't talked about it since. Not specifically. Not in any way that would require either of us to name what happened. The first month after the firing was the worst month I've had as an adult. I applied to 12 places and got 4 callbacks and took a floor associate position at a home improvement chain 40 minutes north of where I'd been living. It paid less. It was physically harder in ways I hadn't expected after 3 years of management. I was 32 years old and stocking shelves next to 19-year-olds who were doing it to save for college. I didn't tell anyone from my old life where I was working. I didn't mention it to my mother when she called on Sundays, which she still did, in the same careful voice. I didn't mention it to the handful of friends who texted to check in after the news spread the way things spread in a neighborhood where people have known each other too long. I found an apartment in the new area. Studio, 2nd floor, small but clean. I brought my laptop and 3 boxes of books and a set of pots and pans, and I set up a kitchen and a desk, and I started over. The anger came about 6 weeks in, after the shock had metabolized and the practical scramble of rebuilding had settled into routine. It came suddenly, which surprised me. I was driving to work on a Tuesday morning in December, the kind of dark, cold morning where the road is empty and the heater is working hard, and I thought about Ricky sitting at my mother's table with his cracking voice, and something went very hot in my chest and stayed there for the rest of the drive. I didn't do anything with it. That's the thing about anger when you're already in survival mode. You don't have time to process it, you just feel it on the way to work, and then you go to work and you do the job and you come home and you sleep and you do it again. The anger doesn't go anywhere. It just compresses. It gets smaller and harder and denser, like something geological. A stone you carry that gets lighter as the weeks pass, not because it weighs less, but because you get get stronger. I worked the floor for 4 months. Then a lead position opened in loss prevention, and I applied for it and got it. That move was important not just because of the pay bump, but because it put me back in the systems. Loss prevention is about patterns, about understanding how things move, and where the gaps are, and what behaviors indicate a problem before the problem becomes visible in the numbers. I was good at it for the same reasons I'd been good at building Gerald's tracking spreadsheet. I could hold multiple data streams in my head and find the relationship between them. My district manager's name was Patricia. She was in her mid-40s, had been with the company for 15 years, and had the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being good at a thankless job for a long time. She was not warm, but she was fair, and she paid attention. 3 months into my loss prevention role, I put together a report on a pattern of internal shrinkage across 3 stores in our district. 46-page report, specific methodology, documented it from the raw transaction data. Patricia read the whole thing over a weekend and on Monday called me into her office and asked me to walk her through the methodology. That report became a process improvement that Patricia submitted to the regional VP under her name, which she told me up front she was going to do and offered me a bonus in exchange. I took the bonus. The process got adopted at 12 stores across the region. 3 months after that, I was offered a department manager role. I took it. I worked it. I learned everything about that level of operation the same way I'd learned everything at Kellerman's, which is to say I stayed late and read the manuals and asked questions that weren't in my job description and kept detailed records of everything. By year 2, I was running a full store as director. 36 employees, 240,000 square feet of floor space, 5 department managers reporting to me, weekly calls with Patricia and the regional VP, a budget I was responsible for, and a P&L I understood down to the decimal. I'd stopped tracking what Ricky was doing somewhere around month 8, not deliberately. There was just less room in my head for it. My mother mentioned him occasionally on Sunday calls, neutral mentions, how Vanessa's job was going, something the kids had done. I listened and responded normally and didn't ask questions. The anger had been there every day for the first year. By the second year, it was there most days. By the time I became store director, it was there some days, a few times a week, surfacing in specific moments that seemed to have no connection to the cause. The smell of sawdust, a hardware store I passed on the way to a vendor meeting. The particular way a certain quality of morning light hit the parking lot at work and briefly looked exactly like the Kellerman's parking lot in November. I was not okay in the way that you can function completely normally and have a successful career and still not be okay about something. The store I ran was in a part of the city that I'd never spent much time in before taking the job. Strip malls and chain restaurants and the specific low-level buzz of a place built for commerce rather than community. I learned the rhythms of it the same way I'd learned every job, by showing up early and staying late and paying attention to the things no one told you to pay attention to, which parking lot entrance the regulars used, which shift change created the most tension on the floor, which vendors needed to be called on Tuesdays instead of Thursdays or they'd miss the order window. Small things that added up to understanding a place. My crew at the new store were different from the Kellerman's crew, but good in their own ways. My floor lead was a woman named Greta, mid-50s, 20 years in retail, completely unflappable and mildly terrifying to anyone who tried to cut corners. My receiving lead was a younger guy, Theo, who had the same quality I'd had at that age, the one where you're hungry enough to learn anything because you know exactly how little you can afford to fail. I liked working with both of them, not in the way I'd liked the Kellerman's crew, which had been built on 4 years of shared history, but in the way you come to trust people through repeated proof of who they are under pressure. I built new systems at the new store the same way I'd built them at Kellerman's. The same logic, the same belief that the right structure prevents most problems before they become problems. It felt strange at first, building things from scratch in a place that wasn't mine yet, like setting up furniture in a house where you're not sure you're staying, but it stopped feeling strange somewhere around the 8-month mark when I realized I'd stopped comparing everything to how it had been before. On a Tuesday afternoon in March, my assistant manager brought me a stack of candidate applications from our third-party recruiting pipeline. We were hiring for 2 positions, a floor lead and a receiving coordinator. The receiving coordinator applications came in a separate folder, 8 candidates, resumes printed front and back. I took the folder to my office and went through them during my lunch break. I got to the 5th application and stopped. The name at the top was Ricky's full name. That alone could have been a coincidence. It's not an uncommon name combination. But then I saw the handwriting on the supplemental form, which we still printed and required candidates to complete manually. Ricky had always written his 7s with a small horizontal crossbar through the stem, the European style, something he'd picked up from a soccer coach in middle school and never dropped. And his spelling was terrible in the specific way of someone who'd been smart enough to get through school without learning to spell correctly. The wrong letters in the wrong places in words that weren't difficult. He'd listed his previous employers. Kellerman's Hardware was the 3rd entry. He'd left the end date column blank. He had no idea I was the hiring manager. The job posting had gone through a recruiting platform with the company name, but not the specific store. And Ricky didn't know I worked here. I hadn't told anyone in my family where I'd ended up. My mother knew I was a store manager somewhere north of the city. That was all I'd given her. I put the application face down on my desk. I went back to my afternoon schedule, 2 vendor calls and a floor walk walk and a one-on-one with my receiving department lead. I moved through all of it completely normally. I ate dinner at my desk, leftover pasta from 2 nights before. I drove home on the usual route. I made coffee I didn't drink. I went to bed. I couldn't tell you anything about what I thought that night because I'm not sure I thought anything. My brain had gone into a specific kind of suspension that I recognized from the period after the firing, just processing on a level below language. The second day I went to work, and the application was still face down on my desk. I turned it face up in the morning and looked at it. Then I turned it back over. I had 2 department manager meetings and a fire drill and a call with Patricia, and I processed all of it without any of it touching the thing that was sitting on my desk. The third day I left the application where it was and drove home in the early evening and went for a walk around the block, which I didn't usually do. It was mid-March, still cold, the kind of cold that's winter pretending to be spring. I walked 3 laps and then sat on the front steps of my building until my hands were cold enough that I had to go in. I thought about what Gerald had done, how he'd been fair, how fairness requires information, and Gerald had made a fair decision with the information available to him. If he'd had my spreadsheet, he would have made a different decision. He'd had the wrong information because I hadn't given him the right information. I thought about what my mother's face looked like when she found out Ryan had started walking. She'd called me, excited, and then a second later said that Ricky and Vanessa were so happy. She'd been including me in the news the way you do when you want someone to feel included and you don't know what else to do. I thought about Ricky's voice when it broke at the kitchen table, the sound it made. On the 4th day, I opened a folder on my personal laptop that I hadn't opened since I'd moved north. The spreadsheet was there, 41 rows, transaction date, time, register number, amount, Ricky's employee ID, discrepancy flag, 2 years old and still exactly as I'd built it. Every cell still populated, every formula still running. I scrolled through it slowly, all the way to the bottom. Then I opened a second subfolder and found the photographs. After Gerald had let me go, I'd gone back to the office to collect my personal items, my coffee mug, a small cactus I kept on the windowsill, a notepad with some reference numbers I wanted. Gerald wasn't there. His wife, who sometimes handled administrative tasks, had been the one to let me in. She was kind and didn't ask questions. I spent about 15 minutes in the office. The termination paperwork was sitting on the corner of Gerald's desk, both copies, the one he'd keep and the one he'd filed. I'd already signed mine and taken it, but I'd noticed something when I signed it, something I hadn't had the presence of mind to process in the moment. In the margin of Gerald's copy, in his handwriting, he'd added a note. It said, "Shortage consistent with pattern of fraudulent returns per register analysis, not single incident." That note changed everything about the legal nature of the document. A single incident cash shortage and a pattern of fraudulent returns are 2 very different things in terms of employment records, background checks, and what that documentation implies about the employee of record. I had photographed both pages of both copies with my phone before I left the office, standing at Gerald's desk for 3 minutes while his wife took a call in the other room. I hadn't known what I was going to do with the photographs. I'd taken them the way you take a photograph of something before it's gone, without a plan, just the instinct to preserve what's real before it disappears. I sat at my kitchen table with the spreadsheet open and the photographs open on my phone and a cup of coffee going cold next to my elbow. I thought about the receiving coordinator position, the job that Ricky had applied for. I thought about what happens when someone with Ricky's history goes into a receiving role where he's handling inventory and returns and has proximity to cash transactions. I thought about the next store, wherever it was, and the next Gerald who would trust his word. Then I thought about something simpler. I thought about the fact that I had built those tracking systems, that the forensic ability to catch this kind of theft existed in the first place because I'd built it, and I'd used it to protect the person doing the stealing. I opened my work email. I wrote 3 lines, flagging this application for thorough background screening before we proceed. I have personal knowledge of a significant integrity concern from a shared prior employer. I have documentation available and am prepared to provide it to HR on request. I attached the spreadsheet as a PDF. I attached the photographs of the termination paperwork as a second PDF. I put the folder with both attachments in a subfolder I labeled clearly. Then I forwarded the application to our HR director, a woman named Beverly who had been with the company for 8 years and was meticulous in a way that I respected. I pressed send and I closed my laptop and I sat there for a few minutes. Then I washed my coffee mug, which I hadn't even drunk from, and went to bed. Beverly called me the next morning before I'd gotten to the office. She'd reviewed both documents overnight. She asked me to walk her through the spreadsheet methodology, specifically how I'd cross-reference the return transactions against the restocking logs and what the employee ID attribution meant in terms of certainty. I walked her through it. She took notes. She asked 2 follow-up questions about chain of custody for the photographs and whether the termination document was an official company record or a personal copy. I told her it was a photograph of an official document, that the original was in Gerald's files. She said that was sufficient for their purposes. She told me to expect a process to follow. I said understood and went to open my store. That afternoon, Beverly called again. She said HR had conducted an intake interview with the candidate that morning under the guise of a standard screening call. Based on the candidate's responses and the documentation I'd provided, the application was being closed and a formal notation was being added to the candidate's file under the company's integrity review protocol. She said she'd send me a summary for my records. She did not tell me what specifically Ricky had said during the intake call. I didn't ask. I went through the rest of that week normally. Floor walk on Wednesday, regional call on Thursday, Saturday morning store meeting with my department leads. I ate lunch most days at my desk. I drove the same route home. I called my mother on Sunday and she talked about the weather and mentioned that Ryan had lost his first tooth. Ricky called on a Thursday night at 9:42. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store, engine running, radio off. I'd stopped to pick up coffee and milk and then just sat there in the lot for a few minutes before I had to drive home. I don't know why. It was the kind of evening where stopping felt necessary. His number appeared on my screen and I looked at it for 4 rings. Then I answered. His voice was different from what I expected. I'd expected anger first, the hot kind, the kind that goes loud immediately. But what I got was the shaky underneath thing. The version that came after anger had already happened and now there was just the wreckage of it. He sounded like he'd been crying or close to it and had made himself stop. He said my name first. Then he said I needed to know what I'd done. He said I had destroyed him, that he'd been called for a screening interview he thought was standard and had spent an hour answering questions that turned out to be based on documents I'd provided. He said they'd pulled his application. He said he knew it was me because Beverly had mentioned documentation from a shared prior employer and there was only one shared prior employer. He said he had a family. He said Connor was 18 months old and Ryan had just started school. He said Vanessa was already stretched thin and this was the one opportunity he'd had in months and I'd reached back 2 years to take it away from him for no reason other than a grudge. He said I was supposed to be his brother. He said the word brother the way he'd said everything my whole life that he needed me to feel responsible for, with the weight of shared history behind it. The camping trip where I'd let him use my sleeping bag, the driver's ed practice in the church parking lot when Dad was sick, the Sunday morning diner, all of it loaded into one word, aimed at the specific place in my chest where it would land the hardest. I let him finish. All of it. Every sentence. Then I waited a few seconds because I wanted what I said next to come out level. I told him I hadn't gone looking for him. His application came to me. It came to me because he'd applied to a job at my store without knowing I worked there. I hadn't sought this out. It had arrived. He started to say something about that being a technicality, about what I did with it being a choice. I told him he was right. It was a choice. The same way it had been a choice to sit at my mother's kitchen table and tell our parents a story that put the missing money on me. The same way it had been a choice every single day for 5 years before that to run those returns and pocket the cash. The same way it had been a choice when Gerald called me into the back office to watch what happened to me and say nothing. Ricky went quiet. I told him I had watched him do it from behind the shelving display on a Thursday afternoon. I told him I had built the spreadsheet that documented 41 transactions before the $800 shortage ever happened. I told him I had sat in Gerald's office with the proof on my personal laptop and said nothing and lost my job and let the silence do what silence does because I was protecting him. I told him I had stood in that driveway with my box and listened to him tell our parents his version of events through the screen door. I told him I had never called my mother and corrected the story. Not once. Not in 2 years. I had eaten it. I had moved 40 minutes away and started over at 32 years old stocking shelves, and I had not said one word to anyone in our family about what actually happened. I said, I covered for you, and then you lied about me. He didn't say anything for a long time. Long enough that I thought maybe the call had dropped. Then he said he was sorry. It came out flat and small. Not the cracking voice. Not the performance. Just 2 words with nothing behind them. The kind of sorry that isn't big enough for what it's covering, and both people know it. I said I heard him. Then I said I had to go, and I hung up. I sat in that parking lot for a while after. The fluorescent lights above the cart return were buzzing with a specific frequency that seemed very loud in the quiet. I watched a woman wrestle a cart out of the return and push it toward the entrance. A man walked out with 2 bags and put them in a pickup truck and stood by the door for a minute looking at his phone before he got in. I thought about calling my mother, about what it would mean to call her and tell her the actual story, to say the word Ricky and then tell her what he'd done and what I'd done and what the silence between those 2 things had cost me. I thought about what her face would look like, or tried to imagine it. I couldn't quite get there. The grocery store was still open. I went in and bought the coffee and the milk I'd stopped for. The woman at the register was the same one who was usually there on Thursday nights. Middle-aged, never looked up from scanning. She said the total. I paid. I put the bag in the passenger seat and drove home. My mother called every Sunday throughout the 2 years between the firing and Ricky's application landing on my desk. I never missed a call. We talked about the same things we'd always talked about. The weather, what she was watching on television, small updates about the neighborhood, how her knees had been bothering her. She never brought up Kellerman's directly. She never asked me to explain what had happened, and I never offered. We both held the shape of what things had been like before, the same way you keep walking on a path even after the ground has shifted underneath it, because stopping feels more dangerous than moving. I think she knew something was wrong with the story she'd been given. My mother was not naive. She'd raised 2 sons and seen enough of both of us to know the difference between how we operated in the world. But knowing something is wrong with a story and being willing to break the story open are very different things. Breaking it open means choosing between your children, at least temporarily. It means looking at one of them and saying, I believe the other one. My mother had spent 40 years avoiding exactly that choice. She wasn't going to start making it at 63, so we kept talking about about the weather. I still haven't told my parents what really happened. Some mornings I think about doing it. I'll be making coffee or driving to work or doing something completely unrelated, and the thought will surface, clear and complete, like it's been sitting just below the water waiting. I think about calling my mother and saying I need to tell you something. I think about what comes after that. Then I think about Ricky at that table, the cracking voice, the slow head shake. I think about how long he's been counting on me to stay quiet, and I think that might be exactly why I should talk.